The sound resonated through the dining hall like a crack of thunder on a still afternoon. Every conversation died. Every fork paused midway to waiting mouths. The sharp report of flesh meeting flesh with violent intention had that effect on people, freezing them in place as if they were witnesses to something that should never happen in the civilized world of academic halls. Sophia Chen sat at the corner table where she always positioned herself, as far from attention as physically possible, while still remaining within the boundaries of social acceptability. Her worn textbooks were stacked neatly beside her simple lunch, the kind of meal that spoke of careful budgeting rather than careless abundance. She had been reviewing chemistry notes when the slap echoed across the room, but she knew without looking up who had delivered it and who had received it. The victim was Elena Martinez, a girl whose very existence seemed to invite the worst impulses of those who confused privilege with permission. Elena stood there now, her hand pressed against her cheek, her dark eyes wide with the kind of shock that comes not from surprise, but from the confirmation of one's worst fears. The red mark spreading across her olive skin told its own story of humiliation and helplessness. The perpetrator was Marcus Wellington, whose surname carried enough weight in this institution to crush anyone who dared challenge his authority. His father didn't just donate to the school, he practically owned it, serving on every board that mattered and wielding influence that trickled down to his son like inherited privilege. Marcus stood there with that familiar smirk, the one that suggested he was above consequences, above reproach, above the basic human decency that governed lesser mortals. But something was different this time. Something was shifting in the carefully ordered hierarchy of Westfield Academy. Elena had endured months of Marcus's particular brand of cruelty. It had started small, as these things often do. Comments about her scholarship status, jokes about her second-hand uniforms, deliberate mispronunciations of her Spanish surname that drew snickers from his circle of enablers. The torment had escalated gradually, each incident building upon the last until it reached this moment of physical violence. Sophia had watched it all unfold from her position in the shadows. She had witnessed every sneer, every whispered insult, every calculated act of social assassination. And she had done nothing, said nothing, intervened not at all. Her own survival strategy depended upon invisibility, upon being so unremarkable that the predators would pass her by in search of more obvious prey. The dining hall remained suspended in that moment of awful silence. Elena's tears were beginning to fall now, tracing silver paths down her cheeks, while Marcus and his friends laughed with the casual cruelty that only comes from those who have never faced real consequences for their actions. The faculty members who should have been supervising were conspicuously absent, probably dealing with administrative matters that seemed more important than the daily dramas of student life. That was when something inside Sophia snapped. Later she would struggle to explain what happened next. The psychologists would call it a breaking point, a moment when accumulated stress and empathy override rational thought. Her mother would call it finding her backbone. Her few friends would call it miraculous. But in that instant, Sophia wasn't thinking about labels or explanations or consequences. She was thinking about justice. Her chair scraped against the floor as she stood, the sound cutting through the nervous laughter like a blade. Every eye turned toward her, this quiet girl who had never caused a scene, never raised her voice, never drawn attention to herself in any meaningful way. For a heartbeat she hesitated, feeling the weight of their stares, the pressure of expectation and surprise. Then she moved. The dining chair beside her table was standard institutional furniture, built for durability rather than comfort. It was heavier than it looked, solid wood and metal construction designed to withstand years of teenage abuse. Sophia's hands closed around its back, and she felt strength flow through her arms that she didn't know she possessed. Marcus was still laughing when the chair connected with his spine. The impact reverberated through the dining hall like a physical force, stunning everyone into absolute silence. Marcus pitched forward, his laughter cutting off mid-breath as pain and shock registered simultaneously. The chair clattered to the floor, and Sophia stood there breathing hard, her small frame trembling with adrenaline and disbelief. She had never hit another human being in her life. She had never even raised her voice in anger, yet here she was, having just delivered justice with her own hands, and the feeling was both terrifying and exhilarating. The aftermath exploded into chaos. Marcus's friends rushed to his aid, shouting threats and demands for retribution. Some students pulled out their phones to record everything, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Others began to cheer, quietly at first, then with growing boldness as they realized that someone had finally done what they had all wanted to do but never dared. Elena stared at Sophia with wonder and gratitude, her own pain momentarily forgotten in the face of this unexpected salvation. For the first time in months, she wasn't the center of unwanted attention. For the first time in months, someone else had taken a stand for her when she couldn't stand for herself. Sophia stood in the center of it all, her heart hammering against her ribs, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just done. Would she be expelled? Would her scholarship be revoked? Would her single mother, working 3 jobs to keep them afloat, have to explain to her employer why she needed time off for disciplinary meetings at her daughter's school? But beneath the fear was something else, something she had never felt before. The fierce satisfaction of refusing to be a bystander to injustice. The headmaster arrived within minutes, drawn by the commotion and the reports of violence that had reached the administrative offices with the speed of wildfire. Dr. Harrison was a man who prided himself on running an orderly institution where problems were solved through proper channels and disciplinary procedures followed established protocols. The scene that greeted him in the dining hall was his worst nightmare. Students in chaos, phones recording everything, and clear evidence that the carefully maintained peace of his academy had been shattered. Marcus was on his feet now, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. The moment he saw Dr. Harrison, he began his demands for immediate punishment, his voice carrying the particular tone of entitlement that came from never having been denied anything he wanted. His father's name was invoked repeatedly, along with threats about funding and board positions, and the various ways that Westfield Academy depended on the Wellington family's continued goodwill. Sophia said nothing. She had learned long ago that explanations rarely helped, and that authority figures generally preferred to hear from those with power rather than those without it. She stood quietly while Marcus painted her as an unstable troublemaker who had attacked him without provocation, while his friends nodded and agreed and added their own embellishments to the story. But this time was different. This time, there were witnesses who weren't intimidated into silence. This time, there were recordings that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. This time, the truth had allies. Elena found her voice first, stepping forward despite her tears to explain what had really happened. Her words came haltingly at first, then with growing strength as other students began to nod and murmur their agreement. The slap had been witnessed by everyone. Marcus's pattern of bullying was known to everyone. The only surprise was that someone had finally done something about it. Dr. Harrison found himself in an impossible position. On one hand, violence could never be tolerated, regardless of the circumstances. On the other hand, the evidence was overwhelming that Marcus had been the initial aggressor and that Sophia's actions, while extreme, had been in defense of another student. The recordings that were already spreading across social media platforms would make any attempt to ignore the context look like favoritism toward the wealthy donor's son. The disciplinary hearing that followed was unlike anything Westfield Academy had ever seen. Parents arrived in waves, some demanding Sophia's expulsion, others insisting that Marcus finally face consequences for his behavior. Local media picked up the story when the social media posts went viral, turning what should have been a private school matter into a public debate about bullying, privilege, and justice. Sophia sat through it all with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her entire academic career. When asked to explain her actions, she spoke simply and honestly about what she had witnessed, about her decision to intervene when no adult was present to do so, and about her regret that violence had been necessary to stop what was happening. "I didn't plan it," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the packed hearing room. "I saw Elena being hurt, and everyone was just watching. I couldn't watch anymore." And the committee deliberated for hours. Outside, students maintained a vigil, many of them carrying signs supporting Sophia and sharing their own stories of Marcus's bullying. The local news crews interviewed parents and students, and the story began to take on a life of its own as part of a broader conversation about accountability in educational institutions. When the decision finally came down, it satisfied no one completely, but reflected the complex reality of what had occurred. Sophia received a suspension for her use of violence, but it was brief and coupled with community service rather than expulsion. Marcus received a longer suspension and was required to attend counseling sessions about bullying and privilege. Both students would be required to participate in a restorative justice program designed to help them understand the impact of their actions. More importantly, the incident prompted a comprehensive review of Westfield Academy's anti-bullying policies and enforcement procedures. Anonymous reporting systems were implemented. Faculty supervision was increased. Training programs were instituted for both students and staff about recognizing and addressing harassment. The changes came too late for Elena, who transferred to another school before the new policies could take effect. But she left behind a letter for Sophia, thanking her for being the friend she had needed when no one else would step forward. That letter would become one of Sophia's most treasured possessions, a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing means accepting the consequences of necessary action. Sophia's return to school after her suspension was nothing like she had expected. Instead of whispers and avoidance, she found herself surrounded by students who wanted to thank her, to share their own stories of being bullied, to express admiration for her courage. Teachers who had barely noticed her before began to see her differently, recognizing qualities of leadership and moral courage that had been hidden beneath her quiet exterior. The attention was overwhelming at first. Sophia had spent so many years cultivating invisibility that being seen and acknowledged felt strange and sometimes uncomfortable. But gradually, she began to understand that her actions had given others permission to find their own voices, to refuse to accept injustice as an inevitable part of their school experience. Marcus never returned to Westfield Academy. His father, facing public scrutiny and questions about his family's values, enrolled him in a military-style boarding school where the discipline was stricter and the social hierarchy less dependent on family wealth. The withdrawal of the Wellington family's financial support caused some initial difficulties for the school, but other donors stepped forward to fill the gap, many of them specifically citing their admiration for how the administration had handled the incident. Sophia's relationship with her mother deepened in the weeks following the incident. Mrs. Chen had initially been terrified when she received the call from the school, fearing that her daughter's scholarship and future were in jeopardy. But as she learned more about what had happened and why, her fear transformed into pride. Her quiet daughter had found the strength to stand up for someone who couldn't stand up for herself, and that took a kind of courage that couldn't be taught in any classroom. "Your father would have been so proud," she told Sophia one evening as they sat together reviewing college applications. Dr. Chen had died when Sophia was 12, leaving behind memories of a man who had always stood up for the underdog, who had believed that education was the path to a better world for everyone, not just those born into privilege. The college essays Sophia wrote that year were different from the ones she had originally planned. Instead of focusing on academic achievements or career goals, she wrote about justice and courage, about the responsibility that comes with witnessing injustice, and about the ways that small acts of bravery can create ripple effects that extend far beyond their original intent. The responses from admissions committees were overwhelmingly positive. Several schools specifically mentioned being impressed by her moral courage and leadership qualities. When acceptance letters began arriving, many came with scholarship offers that would make her college dreams financially possible without requiring her mother to sacrifice even more. The incident at Westfield Academy became a case study in several educational journals, examined as an example of how schools could better address bullying and create environments where students felt empowered to intervene on behalf of their peers. Sophia was invited to speak at conferences and workshops, sharing her story and advocating for systemic changes that would prevent other students from facing the kind of harassment that Elena had endured. As her senior year progressed, Sophia found herself taking on leadership roles she never could have imagined. She became president of the student council, not because she sought the position, but because her classmates recognized in her the qualities of integrity and courage that they wanted in their representatives. She started a peer mediation program that helped students resolve conflicts before they escalated to violence. She organized awareness campaigns about bullying and created safe spaces for students who felt marginalized or targeted. The transformation was remarkable, not just in Sophia herself, but in the entire school culture. Students began looking out for one another more actively. The bystander effect that had allowed Marcus to terrorize Elena and others for so long began to erode as students realized they had the power to intervene and create change. Elena stayed in touch through social media, sharing updates from her new school and expressing gratitude for the friendship that had been forged in that moment of crisis. She was thriving in her new environment, free from the constant stress of harassment and able to focus on her studies and her passion for environmental science. The two girls made plans to meet during winter break, to catch up properly, and to celebrate how much their lives had changed. The anniversary of the incident passed quietly, marked only by a small memorial service that Sophia organized for students who had been affected by bullying. She spoke briefly about the importance of creating communities where everyone felt valued and protected, where differences were celebrated rather than used as weapons, where courage was measured not by physical strength but by willingness to stand up for what was right. Dr. Harrison, who had initially seen the incident as a crisis to be managed, came to understand it as a turning point that had made his school better. In his remarks at graduation, he spoke about the class that had taught him the difference between peace and justice, between order and equity, between following rules and doing what was right. Sophia's graduation speech was brief and heartfelt. She spoke about the power of small actions to create large changes, about the importance of seeing and responding to injustice, about the responsibility that came with education and privilege. She thanked her teachers and classmates for helping her find her voice and urged the younger students to use theirs when it mattered most. As she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, the applause was thunderous and sustained. Students, teachers, and parents rose to their feet in recognition of not just her academic achievements, but her moral courage and leadership. In the audience, her mother wept with pride and joy, thinking of her husband and how proud he would have been of the young woman their daughter had become. The summer before college was filled with preparation and anticipation. Sophia had chosen to study social work and education, drawn by a desire to create systemic changes that would protect vulnerable students and empower communities. Her experiences at Westfield had shown her the power of individual action, but also the need for institutional reforms that could prevent crises rather than simply respond to them. She spent part of the summer working as a counselor at a camp for at-risk youth, where she saw daily reminders of why her future career mattered. Many of the children she worked with had been bullied, marginalized, or failed by systems that should have protected them. Her gentle strength and authentic empathy made her a natural mentor, and she found deep satisfaction in helping them develop the confidence and skills they needed to advocate for themselves. When August arrived and it was time to leave for college, Sophia felt ready for the next chapter of her life. The shy girl who had once hidden in the back row of every classroom was gone, replaced by a young woman who understood her own power and responsibility. She had learned that silence in the face of injustice was itself a choice, and that choosing to act, even when it was difficult or frightening, was what separated bystanders from heroes. Her mother drove her to campus, both of them emotional but excited about the future. As they unpacked her belongings in her dormitory room, Mrs. Chen found the letter that Elena had written years earlier, carefully preserved among Sophia's most important possessions. "You kept this all this time," she observed, her voice soft with understanding. "It reminds me why it mattered," Sophia replied, "and why it still matters." The letter had been read and reread so many times that the paper was soft with handling, but the words remained as powerful as ever. "Thank you for seeing me when everyone else looked away. Thank you for caring when no one else did. Thank you for showing me that I wasn't alone." As her freshman year began, Sophia threw herself into her studies and campus activities with the same quiet determination that had characterized her high school transformation. She joined the peer advocacy program, volunteered at local schools, and began developing ideas for her senior thesis on systemic approaches to preventing bullying in educational settings. Her professors quickly recognized her unique combination of academic ability and real-world experience. When she shared her story in class discussions, her classmates listened with rapt attention, many of them seeing parallels to their own experiences as witnesses to or victims of injustice. Her perspective, forged in the crucible of moral crisis and personal growth, added depth and authenticity to theoretical discussions about social change and individual responsibility. The ripple effects of that day in the Westfield Academy dining hall continued to spread in ways both large and small. Other schools adopted similar policy changes after learning about what had happened. Students in other districts began speaking up more actively when they witnessed harassment. Parents became more engaged in conversations about bullying and institutional culture. Sophia often thought about the moment when she had stood up from her corner table and picked up that chair. In the years since, she had come to understand it not as a single act of violence, but as the first step in a journey toward justice. The chair had been a symbol, a tool of disruption that had shattered more than just the silence in that dining hall. It had shattered the assumption that some people were powerless, that some voices didn't matter, that some injustices were simply part of the natural order. The girl who had once defined herself by her invisibility now understood that being seen, being heard, being present in the world was both a privilege and a responsibility. She had learned to use her voice not just to advocate for herself, but to amplify the voices of others who struggled to be heard. She had discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. As she looked toward the future, Sophia knew that her path would continue to be shaped by the lessons learned in that moment of crisis. She would spend her career working to create systems and structures that prevented students like Eleanor from suffering in silence, that empowered students like herself to act with confidence rather than desperation. that held students like Marcus accountable before their actions escalated to harassment and violence. The story that had begun with a slap on a chair had become something larger than its individual components. It had become a testament to the power of moral courage, the importance of individual action, and the possibility of systemic change. Most importantly, it had become proof that even the quietest voices, when raised at the right moment, could change everything.